Hey guys, guess what? I recorded this whole video and my audio wasn't recording. So here I am recording it all over again. Is it recording now? It's definitely recording this time. Camera's on, audio good, screen record good. Okay, let's do this again. Hey guys, this is D.I.D. CHOI, and as you saw in the title, this is a mock-up breakdown video for the Shawshank Redemption end title scene. So diving straight in, if you haven't seen the mock-up video yet, what are you doing? Go watch it right now. It's right there. Make sure to listen to the whole thing because I won't be playing it in its entirety in this video because 2 of my videos get copyright claimed, right? Not that it matters, you know, if it gets copyright claimed anyways, oh well. But, you know, it's nice to have a little bit of ad revenue sometimes, right? A little bit of allowance. It's nothing much really. But anyways, I basically made this Shawshank Redemption end title scene mock-up as a part of kind of an assignment at school where we were to basically go off the score and make it as accurately as possible using just the score and not using the reference recording, which meant that, you know, I'm not listening to the phrasing, I'm not listening to the orchestra's internal balance from the original recording. This is basically just a completely different interpretation based on the same score. One caveat though is, for the sake of this video, after doing the assignment, I brought in the original recording. I basically tempo mapped it. If you want to learn how to make a great tempo map, check out these videos up here where I also break down how Rubato works. Okay, so the instruments I used for this mock-up were basically primarily Cinematic Studio strings and brass, as well as the Berlin woodwinds, which is basically my trifecta setup. I love it so much. Occasionally here and there for certain brass passages I use sample modeling and the Orchestral Tools Majestic Horn, which is also by Organic Sampling, which Orchestral Tools is distributing. Initially, when I got this assignment, I was planning to layer the strings with chamber strings, but I found that they sounded really good on their own, super expressive, and, you know, possibly I think it just really fit the style of this Thomas Newman style of writing that I didn't feel the need to layer. They just sounded perfectly good on their own. The legatos were flawless, and because of the way Cinematic Studio strings is just so meticulously, consistently programmed, I could have everything quantized to the grid and a lot of the time use the same automation between the different instruments, and it still sounded fantastic. A lot of you might say, oh, you gotta use different automation, you gotta play in each line separately, which is true to an extent, but the goal is to do it fairly quickly, right? The point of the assignment was to make our own interpretation based on the score at a fairly quick turnaround, kind of like what a composer's assistant might be doing. So the point of this was not to make the most accurate, you know, super realistic mock-up. It was to make a really good quality mock-up in a short amount of time that we could just go out to the director or whoever needs to see the mock-up to get approval, right? So for something like that, just having the same automation, copy and pasting and adjusting a couple things. Here, these 2 tracks are based on the same track. You can see that they're even named the same thing. Here you can see there are very big differences in the automation because after copy and pasting, I would come in, set my secondary thing to pencil. And if you click command, you can just draw whatever you want. And that's basically what I did for a lot of this stuff. The other nice thing about using the Cinematic Studio stuff is that you can copy and paste stuff from the string section to the brass section and it translates really well. All the articulations are similarly mapped, the 2 sections are balanced nicely together. You know, maybe a little bit of volume adjustment here and there, but oftentimes they work really well. Similar with the Berlin woodwinds, a lot of these, you can see that they have been copy and pasted from other regions. Here the brass doubles the bassoon, so I just copy and pasted the bass trombone part and did a little bit of fiddling too. Here I just copy and pasted the violin 2 part for all of these. So on and so forth, they just work. The only thing you need to make sure of before we get into the music is the negative delays. Now, I made a whole video on doing different negative delays with Cinematic Studio stuff right up here. That could include the Thanos plugin, scripter stuff, and manual adjusting. And for this new template that I've been trying to develop, 5.0, yes. After all of that 4.8, 4.9, all that stuff, I've decided I'm going to do a complete overhaul. A lot of the same instruments, but I'm completely changing the routing around to better suit stems and stuff. And I'll be making a video hopefully on that soon, as soon as I get more used to the template and figure out all the little kinks in it. For this template approach, none of the tracks have a track delay on them, because that whenever I press the spacebar, there is a little bit of time that Logic has to use to calculate those delays, and I'm not a huge fan of that. So in the past, I've been using just manual note offsets by holding down Alt and the arrow keys, which nudge by a value of 10 milliseconds for every click, and just knowing what the delays are for Cinematic Studio strings. All the legatos. In this mockup, I started to experiment with region delays. Unfortunately, Logic doesn't let you do accurate millisecond delays, and they just do ticks and note values. And you can get an approximate millisecond value depending on what the tempo is. So I chose the one that was closer to 100 milliseconds because all of this was legato writing. If I had longer sections of short strings, or if they were interchanging, I might just do 60 milliseconds and offset the long notes by another 40 milliseconds manually, or something like that. But just the reason for that is just having everything quantized properly is just a faster workflow if you ever have to export stuff for orchestration or notation in general. But as a result of that delay, you can see that some of these first notes have been pushed further back 100 milliseconds just to accommodate the legato delay, which doesn't exist on the first note. All right, I think that's enough talking and explaining. Let's break some of this down and take a look at some of Newman's orchestration. Okay, so the beginning basically starts with the strings, a timpani swell, and a suspended cymbal swell. We have horn and bassoon doubling the strings, adding a more warmth to the sound, classic doubling. So let's listen to the strings alone here. A little bit of a break there going into that next phrase. Right, and let's listen to the wind parts here, the horn and the bassoon. So the horn is playing a much more kind of counter melody, while the bassoons are doing more of a harmonic doubling with cellos and viola. So together they just add this really lush tone. Okay, moving on to this next section here. Little break. Next. Pull away for that high note. So you can see in this section here, I added a little bit of a breath, a little lift, mostly through the expression automation. And that was an intentional decision by me, which is not really reflected in the score. I just wanted a little more character, a little more of that phrasing to sound humanistic. And I think a real ensemble would have kind of pulled back in a couple of those positions. A similar thing happens right here too. So let's listen to this part again. All right, and there we go to the winds now. Nice little chorale there. Nice 2-bar phrasing as well. That little violin suspension, just ramp up the automation. Just beautiful harmonic writing. So we jump to 4 woodwinds, 2 oboes and 2 clarinets playing the melody in unison, I believe it was. Yeah, they're all playing in unison. I have slightly different automation for each, while low brass is basically doing an accompaniment. It was really challenging here to get the right not brassy sound from Cinematic Studio strings, because oftentimes they are built for the more cinematic stuff, which is a little more raspy. So you can see here, I basically used the same recording and copy and pasted, but adjusted the automation quite a bit to fit each instrument's golden kind of beautiful round brassy range. Not brassy, like the round brass chocolatey kind of sonore kind of range. So you can see here the alto trombones are quite low, while the bass trombone is a little higher and the tuba is highest. The horn has the same automation as the tuba. It's also loudest because, just following the Rimsky-Korsakov theory that 2 horns is equal to 1 other brass instrument. So like the trumpet, trombone, or the tuba kind of thing. That applies at a more louder dynamic. At a quieter dynamic, they just naturally balance each other.
The code is more what you'd call guidelines than actual rules.
This is kind of in the middle, so I just boosted the horns a tiny little bit to kind of even them out. So let's listen just to the brass. A little bit of a swell into a natural nice release, and the woodwinds. And I find that a really peculiar doubling that Newman chose to do here, or his orchestrators. 2 oboes in unison, which is very strange. You often hear the joke, how do you tune 2 oboes? You shoot one of them. LA studio musicians who probably recorded this. I don't know who recorded this, but whoever the studio musicians were, obviously they can play in tune, and it would have worked. But also doubled with the clarinet, which, someone like Adler says, don't do that unless you're going for a very specific color. By the way, this timpani swell was also a bit challenging to program naturally, because oftentimes percussion libraries are built to do rolls that go up rather than come down. So this swell was a little hard to massage, required a bit of reverb to kind of balance it out. Towards the end of it, it sounds natural, but that little peak section there, it's kind of like it doesn't really know what to do. But anyways, moving on. Such beautiful writing there. One thing I really found interesting with this is, look at all these parallel fifths. Bach would faint after seeing this voice leading, and it kind of really fits that old folksy style of Granger and his wind ensemble pieces. Yeah, it really gives that kind of Granger vibe. Beautiful suspensions. Yeah, nice little break right there. You can see in the automation again, rather than going straight through and plowing through like the score might imply, you gotta try to be more like a musician. Think about the phrasing. Again. Nice little horn counter melody here. And here I'm using the transpose technique, where I just went in here and transposed the instrument down a semitone in this case and tuned it up a semitone so that we'd just be using different round robins, different samples, and we wouldn't get that phasing issue. For certain libraries, you might need to do more than 1 semitone, maybe 2 or 3, or even more sometimes. But it seems to work here without any phasing, even though these have the same automation. No, slightly different. I did change it a bit just in case. Just gonna solo the brass. So that little trumpet call there was very challenging to program and get in the right tone. I think in the original, they have a much more rounder sound. This was about as round as I can get. You can see here, I have a muted CSB solo trumpet region. Originally, I just had CSB on, but it just sounded too brassy and too piercing. It didn't sound like a nice, legato, beautifully played line. It sounds okay. It sounds like a nice trumpet call, but it wasn't really what the music was calling for. So what I ended up doing is I added in some sample modeling trumpet to just add a little bit more variation and a little bit more warmth with a nice IR and EQ. I think the trumpets just didn't really fit with this piece. They were the biggest challenge for me, definitely. Anyways, here the strings take over with the woodwinds. The woodwinds really warm it up. Swell. Yeah. I felt like it needed to be two separate little swells. It just felt more expressive, more natural. You lose a bit of the attack there, but because there is a nice harp, it kind of fills that attack in. And that harp is basically just the contact factory selection, whatever VSL kind of thing. I went in and added a bit of an EQ, cutting out the lows and the highs, so it would sound more like it's in a hall and it's losing some of those frequencies, as well as some reverb, of course. And it sounds totally passable. Alright, anyways, moving on. This was the most difficult section for me. It was basically a brass chorale kind of thing with the horns taking the melody. Originally I had it up here with CSB, but ended up moving it to majestic horn and sample modeling horn. It just felt a little chunky. You know, it's a legato articulation, but it just kind of feels like a portato kind of articulation. It's just not quite as smooth, and it's a little too brassy for me. So I ended up using a mix of these two. And keeping the accompaniment in the lower horns. Right. Meanwhile, keeping the trombones nice and tame with varying modulation so that they wouldn't overpower and sound too brassy. Right. And this trumpet solo was also very challenging. And the reason for that, again, I was using the CSB trumpet, but it just sounded too bright. And because it's under the spotlight, you really hear the little flaws of the sample library. Meanwhile, sample modeling, it's really smooth. It has a better roundness in those little quieter regions. And because of the independent vibrato control, you can really add in what you want. There you go. Now the climax section right here, just gonna take a listen to the winds first. They're all playing the same melody in unison. I literally use the same thing, just offset their octaves. Same automation from the violin 2 part. And while they're the same automation, you can kind of hear that their attacks aren't all together. And that goes to tell you that even with the same modulation and the same quantization of notes, because libraries are not all perfect and they're all programmed slightly differently with each different instrument, the most consistent one I can think of is Cinematic Studio. But, you know, in this case with Berlin woodwinds, you can hear that each instrument kind of has a different range of velocities and dynamic layers, which means that despite having the same automation, they sound like they have different automation and different note values. These are obviously from the bass trombone. Okay, so that's the woodwinds there at the climax. Let's add in the strings. The strings are going to be basically the meat and potatoes in this section, with the winds kind of just adding a nice shimmering gloss on top. And of course the brass just really fill in that middle section. Really nice intensity with the written G's in the horn, especially in this little suspension part here. Really nice counter melody here with the trumpets and the oboes. Now, just like in this case, the oboes aren't really heard, but they can add a bit of a more piercing nature to the trumpets, and it also gives them something to do instead of just resting. Yeah, poor woodwinds. Clarinet player here, so I understand. Anyways, this beautiful little chorale fades down into just clarinet and bassoon, and it's beautiful. Nice little lift there. Space to breathe as well. Okay, this little end section, so beautiful, and CSS just does it really well. The writing's beautiful, and the programming, not to toot my own horn, but the samples just sound really fantastic here. As Christian Henson used to say, samples can make you really feel, but real players can make you cry. It's just so nice, and especially at the end here, the really low dynamics work really well. So expressive, so nice. So as I was talking about quantization and stuff like that, you just need to know the libraries, and if you're copy and pasting within two of the same instruments, then you'll get all the phasing issues and stuff. But with different instruments, like, I really don't really see a problem in copy and pasting the automation and just changing the notes, maybe adjusting a little bit of stuff here and there, especially like suspensions, you want to accentuate more, right? So a little bit of tweaking, actually like hard quantizing this stuff and adding a tempo map. If there wasn't a tempo map and it was a constant tempo, then maybe just keeping in the non-quantized, more rubato-like playing that you did might be more helpful, or it might not. Especially with short strings and stuff like that, especially from Spitfire, because the samples aren't all cut evenly with the same attack offset, even if you hard quantize everything and you bounce it out, you'll see that the notes are not on the grid. Of course, they're not on the grid because there's a delay, but even if you compensate for the delay, they're all at different spots, right? So while Spitfire says you don't have to quantize, you got to make it more human, sometimes just hard quantizing can still keep it human because of the attack offsets. And again, with this rubato tempo map, you can really see how much extra time they take on the third beat of some of these bars. Like I was mentioning, you know, at the end of the bar, they kind of take extra time, and then they ramp up and then take extra time at the end again. That's just generally how rubato seems to work in a lot of the recordings that I analyzed. Anyways, that was basically the breakdown of this mock-up. Make sure to go and listen to it. Let me know if you have any questions that came up from this. Maybe I missed something, I didn't explain something fully, or maybe something wasn't clear. Or if you have any suggestions for me to make things even better, let me know. Recently I got into contact with someone who does fantastic programming. I'll probably talk about it more in future videos, but just having other people to look at your work and exchanging kind of workflows and stuff is so helpful. So definitely make sure to leave a comment. I'll try to respond as promptly as I can. Please leave a like, comment, subscribe, notification bell, all that good stuff. This has been D.I.D. CHOI, and I'll see you in the next one.